Today we have with us Dr. Milan Vaishnav, Senior Associate from the South Asia Program at Carnegie. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thanks.
Milan. We're discussing today the IS meets big data, your new study. Could you tell us more about what big data and how you want to leverage big data to shed light on the black box that is bureaucracy?
Sure. I mean, I think the
Yeah.
first point of the study was to really say there are actually a number of people, researchers, who've already used big data to study the way in which the IS performs, the way in which officers move up the ranks, the way in which particular officers can have impacts, tangible impacts on governance or development outcomes. And so the first objective of the paper is to sort of scan across these quote-unquote big data studies to sort of figure out what are the emerging themes or common takeaways from these 6 papers that we review. Then I think going forward, I mean, one of the takeaways from the paper is the IS collects a lot of data about itself, about its officers, about their qualifications, about their backgrounds, and there are now all kinds of ways through government sources, private sources, to collect big data on outcomes. So outcomes related to social service delivery, outcome related to law and order, outcome related to poverty reduction, and that you can actually take those 2 sets of information, detailed information on officers and detailed information on outcomes, and actually put them together so you could use that data to decide how you're going to allocate officers, how you're going to assign them, and I think importantly how you're going to evaluate them. I mean, this will not be the be-all end-all for how you evaluate officers, but data could certainly be one component of whether or not officer is deemed as doing a good job or a bad job or somewhere in between.
Right. So, what do you think about lateral entry, and do you think that's the right way to move from a generalist cadre to a more specialist IS?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to recognize about the IS is that it is a generalist service, that there are opportunities to specialize, but that's not the general ethos of the service. But increasingly we live in a world where you have to deal with regulatory issues, complicated economic issues, complicated policy issues, where some specific sectoral expertise would be really valuable. And so many people have talked for many years about bringing in lateral entry, which tends to be focused on bringing in people from the private sector or people from think tanks or research institutions, which is one part. But I think an equally, if not more important part, is actually lateral entry, meaning bringing in people from other services. So there are a range of All India services. So we have the revenue service, we have the economic service, and not being so rigidly attached to norms of seniority. So there may be a joint secretary for capital markets, for instance, in the Ministry of Finance, where there may be a very good officer who wouldn't necessarily be have enough experience to be qualified as joint secretary, but has all of the right sectoral experience, and we should have more of that competition. So I think lateral entry actually is good for the IS, and it's good for bringing in other services which don't get as much play often in the Indian system.
Right. So when we talk about administrative reforms, in your study you've referenced the Administrative Reforms Commission, other expert committees that were set up to reform the IAS. But how do you weigh in on the K.S. Radhakrishnan judgment, which was the T.S.R. Subramanian versus Union of India case?
Yeah.
Right.
I think there is this whole debate about whether or not you should have civil service protections. I think one thing which is pretty clear from the data is that there is excessive political interference in the IS when it comes to arbitrary or politically motivated transfers, right? And you see that anecdotally, and you see that very clearly in the data, that the average tenure for many IS officers is well short of what the posting should be. You see huge changes around elections. You see huge changes when there are political shocks and say a new chief minister comes. And so I do think that there has to be some provision that would allow there to be kind of an independent group to kind of mediate between sort of politicians and officers in deciding on postings and transfers. Now, because that's very politically contentious, and there may be good reasons to transfer officers also. Maybe they're underperforming, maybe it turns out after 6 months into the job, they're not the best fit. So there is a compromise solution which says for particularly critical posts, you could develop a stability index. So say there's a norm that on average people should be in this job for 2 years. That doesn't mean every single person who holds that job has to be in for 2 years, but on average, say over, some specified period of time, that should be the target, and that should be what the board seeks to maintain.
So you don't necessarily agree that the civil services boards that have been mandated to be constituted by this judgment will do the job, because every state has to set up a CSB.
Yeah.
And we've seen in UP, for example, they have a transfer policy since 2008, but they're one of the states that is still very infamous for politically motivated transfers.
I think the real trick is how you design these boards in a way that gives them some real teeth, right? And that's something that politicians have often been reluctant to do because, they still at the end of the day want to be able to have some influence on where officers go, right? So I think it's a challenge across the board for regulatory agencies. You set up an independent, say, technocratic board, and how do you somewhat insulate it from sort of political pressures, right? So it is a design challenge, but I think it's one that we have to go through because clearly the status quo of arbitrary punishment is not a great equilibrium that we're in.
We know how IAS has come to monopolize a lot of the top positions in government, and that has led to resentment amongst the other services. The Home Secretary is always an IAS officer, even though the domain expertise would lie with a career IPS officer.
Sure.
Similarly, the CHE. So, how would if we constitute civil services boards, don't you think that would kind of like entrench them more into having like a sort of a self-referential collegium system that makes them even more of an elite public administrative service that is dominating position? So how do we break away from that?
I think that everything is linked, right? So why do we not consider more IS officers to be chief election commissioners or the CAG or other secretary or tribunal heads, right? Part of the problem is we're not casting our net wide enough. But that's linked to the fact that at lower rungs, so say joint secretary, additional secretary level, a lot of these positions aren't open up to competition outside of the IAS. So by the time you're looking at senior level people, you sort of look at their CVs and they haven't had the requisite experience. But you have to give them an entry point somewhere, right? So one of the recommendations which comes out of a lot of studies and discussion papers on the civil service is let's throw open positions above, say, joint secretary level to open competition. So say there was a really good IPS officer who qualified for some position in the Home Ministry. Then that person then gains support, gains experience, moves up the ranks, gets noticed, and then gets on people's radar for holding a senior level position, right? So unless you create an entry point lower down, it's going to be very hard for these people. Indian Economic Services is a great example, to kind of plug in again at the top, right? So they're sort of both linked. So you need to give an entry in order for them to even be considered as part of this sort of broader pool. I think there's a secondary point of we actually know very little about these other services, right? The IAS sucks up a disproportionate amount of attention. Now, it occupies arguably the most important positions in India, so there's a reason for that. But I think we need to be using data in cooperation with the government to figure out what's happening to the IES, what's happening to the Revenue Service. The police service is a great thing. We have crime statistics. We have detailed career profiles in theory, although they're not made freely available, of police officers. We can actually look at these two things to do a very similar study. So I think that's really kind of on the research side where the frontier ought to be.
All right. Money and muscle power in politics, and how bad candidates and how they might actually fill a very important role where rule of law is not the norm, and so they fill the important role of being providers. So sometimes we are not electing parliamentarians, but we are electing providers. So are there any interesting insights that you could give a preview of?
Sure. I mean, I
your
think these
book?
two subjects are linked, right? I mean, the motivation for studying the IAS is that, I mean, as everyone acknowledges, there's a huge governance problem in India, and public institutions have not enjoyed the kind of rejuvenation that many other parts of the Indian polity have, whether it's the economy, whether it's society, whether it's politics, whether it's foreign policy. And it's that mismatch between democracy and institutions that gives people space, criminals space, to be sort of political entrepreneurs, to sort of serve as Robin Hoods who can get stuff done. And I think that, you know, what we have to reframe our discourse in a different way, which is, you know, people are often voting for these individuals because of their criminality rather than in spite of their criminality, because their criminality almost connotes an ability sort of to get stuff done. It makes them credible. They're willing to do whatever it takes by hook or by crook because governance isn't there. The state can't deliver services impartially, deliver justice, public order, security. And so eventually voters are doing the very rational thing, which is looking for somebody who is going to fill in those gaps. And so that's the main argument of the book, and it sort of takes readers through sort of every link in the chain. Why do these people want to run for office? Why do parties want to give them tickets? Why do voters actually want to vote for them when they're given a choice at the ballot box? And what are the policy steps that we can use to try to, you know, free up the political system from, you know, sort of criminal elements?
Election Commission cannot quantify anything on muscle power, but they do have spending limits. How do you think that contributes to making election financing underground? So that pushes expenditure underground and actually feeds into your other work on corruption. So I'm just trying to think of a link between your work.
Yeah.
How does what do you think about election spending and reform?
I mean,
on
I
that
think
front?
I mean, I think there's two parts of the puzzle. So there's a supply side and a demand side. So the supply comes from the fact that parties know that elections are increasingly costly, and that their organizations have atrophied and weakened over time. So over time, they have leapt towards candidates who can be self-financing. That means they can pay the cost of campaigning, they can pay parties for tickets, they can subsidize other candidates, and so that's where the supply comes in. So parties are willing to take that bet, and then the demand comes in from the voter side, you know, who are looking for sort of governance and order, right? Now, I think spending limits are laughably small. And so most people just frankly ignore them as sort of irrelevant. And I think what you need to do is have a system where you have more realistic spending limits, but also better audit capacity and teeth. So if you find somebody who's misspending or spending under the table and doesn't report it, those people need to face some real sanction. Right now, they often get off with a slap on the wrist. The Election Commission doesn't have very clear authorities about what it can do, so it refers back to Parliament saying you need to give us more authority. So we're stuck in this vicious sort of circle. And I think now is the time to think about, you know, a grand bargain where parties will sign up to more transparency, better disclosure requirements, and the limits will also be lifted. And there could even be the possibility at some point of state funding, but not until parties open up their own affairs, because otherwise parties will take state funds and take the black money too, right? Which just makes the problem worse than it already is.
Right. Thank you so much.